The Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, or LCVP, was designed by Andrew Higgins and based on boats used in swamp and marshy areas. Usually constructed from plywood to save weight and cost, but with steel armour in key places, it was capable of ferrying 36 soldiers to shore at about 9 knots, or alternatively, a jeep with a reduced capacity for personnel. The benefit of the shallow draft of the vessel, along with the front-loading ramp, meant that it saw use in many landing operations in various theatres of World War II following its introduction to service in 1942. Join me in this video as I build and review the 1/72nd scale Higgins LCVP from Airfix. For a more detailed look inside the box of this kit, I completed an unboxing review of this model, and that video can be found on my channel. For this video, however, I will focus on the quality of the build and what it looks like at the end. As always, before I get started, please remember that adult supervision may be required when building model kits due to the use of sharp tools and toxic paints and chemicals. Airfix recommends this kit to those aged 8 years and older. So, without any further ado, let's get into it. As recommended in the instructions, the plastic parts were given a wash in warm soapy water. This will help remove any dirt or oil left over from the moulding process and give a good clean surface for paints and cements to stick to later. With that done, I left them to air dry. I removed the various parts from the sprue using either a cutter or a sharp knife. I will then carefully cut away any excess plastic or sand it smooth using a file. The first parts I have prepared here are those for the cabin area of the boat, or probably more accurately, the operator's area, as there are not really any internal spaces on this build. All these parts locate into various slots or grooves for ease of placement. I used Tamiya extra thin cement for the majority of this build, as it flows into gaps and provides a firm bond between the plastic parts. The little brush in the lid makes it really easy to get it in the right places too. I also used some Revell contactor with the needle applicator to get some cement in some really specific places. Here I'm adding the various parts that make up the control panel area. A small part which represents the throttle is cemented onto the side, and tweezers might be a useful tool here as it is rather small and fiddly to get right. With that in place, the top part can now be cemented on as well. I can now begin on the main hull of the boat, with the cabin area being cemented into its grooves. A bulkhead can then be added towards the rear of this area. The two sides of the boat can be cemented into place and they line up well, provided everything was cemented in the right place in the previous steps. With the sides now attached, the stern of the boat can be added. Some internal detailing parts are cemented into place. Two longer components cement along each wall of the hull, whilst some controls are glued further towards the rear. The main deck can now be added. Again, it cements into place with no real issues. I particularly like the moulded detail on this part, with the treadway for the vehicles being well represented. I'm now going to begin work on the prop assembly. The propeller is glued onto its shaft, which is then cemented into the groove in the bottom of the hull. There are some small locating holes here, which again make sure everything lines up properly. The rudder mount is then cemented onto the end of the propeller assembly, and the rudder carefully positioned. It has been intended in the design of this kit that the rudder be able to move left and right freely if no cement is used. It should be held securely in place by the locating holes. This kit comes with a cradle for the landing craft to sit on. I'm not entirely sure how historically accurate the design of this is, as from my research there doesn't seem to be any set design that was used for supporting the vessel whilst being maintained on land. It would seem that strips of wood was commonly used for this purpose. I feel as though Airfix have used a little modeller's license with the inclusion of this, but it's not bad as it gives you a way of displaying the boat. The various girders simply glue and slot together. You do have to make sure you get the central ones in the correct order though, as they have a specific way of supporting the boat. With that complete, I can now move back to the LCVP. The top of the boat is now added and is cemented onto the top edges of the sides of the hull. The two strips are next to be cemented onto the sides of the boat. Life rings are then glued onto the front internal walls. This is then followed by the mounts for the two 30 cal machine guns towards the rear of the LCVP, along with the small bulkhead that runs between them. Next, I focus my attention on the loading ramp of the vessel. It comes with the option of installing the window in the open or closed positions. I opted to cement mine closed by simply gluing it over the slot. This triangular part at the bow of the boat is then glued on top of the ramp. The whole door assembly can then be added to the model. Again, it's up to you how you do this. I decided to cement it closed, but it is possible to position it open as well. And that is the majority of the build complete. I have left some small detailing parts off for the time being, which I will add after painting. The first coat of paint this kit received was this cheap matte white spray paint. As I've chosen to do the Royal Navy paint scheme included in the kit, I thought this would provide a good starting point for it. The paint was applied in thin even layers, working in a side-to-side motion. Please remember to wear the correct protective equipment and use an appropriate environment when you're doing this sort of activity. Next, Humbrol 32 dark grey matte acrylic was thinned with Tamiya X20A acrylic thinners at a rough ratio of 2 parts paint to 1 part thinner. This will help prevent the paint from leaving brush strokes when it dries, but a couple of thin layers might be needed. I painted this onto all the internal areas of the landing craft, and with hindsight this was not my best move. If I was spray painting this area it would have been much easier, but to brush paint this when it was all assembled became very difficult and time consuming. It might have been more beneficial to paint these parts before building them, as I struggled to get the paintbrush into some of the nooks and crannies. After some considerable time though, I managed to get to a point that it looked as though I'd painted the entire area. The cradle for the boat also received this colour of paint. Humbrol 96 RAF Blue Matte Enamel was thinned with a little white spirit, but before I could paint it onto the sides of the boat in the camouflage scheme, I'd noticed that I'd been less than careful with the grey acrylic paint, and some of it was on the sides of the hull. I carefully removed the excess paint with a cotton bud soaked in acrylic thinners. With that done, the blue camouflage pattern was applied with a medium brush by hand. I used the painting instructions as a guide, but pretty much guessed where it should go. Again, a couple of layers would be needed to get a good uniform colour. Whilst that paint is drying, I'll focus on the two machine guns. They had previously been spray painted with a cheap can of matte black spray as the base layer. But for a more metallic effect, I'll also add a coat of Humbrol 53 gunmetal grey whilst they are still on the sprue. Humbrol 33 matte black acrylic was used to paint the steering wheel. Here I'm masking the sides of the hull using Tamiya masking tape. This will form a straight and neat edge between the upper camouflage scheme and the lower hull red. I used Revell 83 matte rust paint, which had been previously thinned with white spirit in the tin, as it is a very old pot and I'm trying to get as much life out of it as I can. A number of thin layers were applied to the hull of the boat. With that done and the paint now dry, the masking tape can be removed. It did a good job with only a few small areas requiring some cleaning up. Plasticoat satin spray varnish was now applied to the hull in preparation for receiving the decals. A smooth satin or gloss layer will help prevent the decals from silvering when they are applied. Identify the correct decals for my paint scheme and cut them from the sheet. They were then soaked in warm water and left to release from the backing paper. I brushed Humbrol Decal Fix into the correct areas of the model and then carefully slid the transfer into place. They were correctly positioned and then some more Decal Fix applied over the top. This solution will help soften the transfers into the surface of the model and make them appear as though they are painted on. With the transfers now applied and completely cured, a further coat of Plasticoat satin varnish was applied to the model to give a uniform finish and protect the decals in the next step. Now it's time to do some weathering. I'm going to use Citadel Null Oil Acrylic Black Wash to bring out some of the details. It was brushed onto the model and will collect in the details, giving the impression of dirt and grime. I left it to dry and then the excess wash was removed using a cotton bud soaked in acrylic thinners. This left the wash in the recessed areas whilst removing it in the raised ones, helping to give contrast. Next, Humbrol 11 Silver Acrylic was dry brushed over the model. A small amount of paint was applied to the brush, then removed onto a paper towel. The brush is then used on the model and the residue of the paint will collect on raised details, helping to give them a metallic and slightly chipped effect. Humbrol 12 Copper and 53 Gunmetal Grey acrylics were now mixed together to give a metallic rust looking paint. I used this in the same way as the previous paint to dry brush over the details and add a further layer of weathering. I also used it to create a streaking effect of the seawater, causing the boat to rust in places around any metallic parts. The propeller can now be carefully painted with the Humbrol 32 Dark Grey acrylic. The steering wheel was then cemented into place. The 30 cal machine guns need to be assembled before they can be added to the model. The magazine boxes are cemented to the side of the gun, then the armour plate is attached. These guns were then cemented into their mounts at the rear of the boat. And that's as far as I went with my build of the Airfix LCVP in 1/72 scale. So, what do I think of this kit? Well, the mould quality is good, with some nice details being reproduced, and I didn't notice any real issues with flash on the plastic parts. The fit of these parts are really good too. The instructions are easy to follow, and the included painting instructions are printed in colour, which makes that so much better. The decals are printed to a good standard and apply to the model well too, so no issues there. There are a couple of points I'd raise though. Firstly, and this was more an error on my part, is the painting of the interior. As previously mentioned, I found this difficult as I did it after I had built it. Had I sprayed the area, it wouldn't have been so bad, but for brush painting, I should have painted these areas first. Speaking of the interior painting, I feel that Airfix could have included some more information about those internal areas. I don't wholeheartedly believe that life rings would have ever been painted grey, for example, but in their instructions they are. A little more guidance there would have been beneficial. Another point I want to raise is that on the box artwork you can clearly see that the vessel is being operated by a crew. But when you build this kit you can't help but feel that you've been shortchanged as no crew is included. Why depict them on the box if they aren't in the kit? I know some people would say that it's just artistic license, but it would have been nice to have the option, particularly given that they tend to include them with their aircraft kits. It's a little disappointing. The inclusion of the display stand though is a nice touch, which means that when it's on display on my shelf it won't be listing over to one side or the other. Anyway, on an unrelated note, I thought I would answer the inevitable question that someone will undoubtedly ask. Will it float? And the answer is yes. Yes, it does. Actually, it floats surprisingly well, and I'm sure for those technically minded of you out there, it would probably make an interesting conversion to a remote controlled model. Just an idea. But enough of that, let's start to wrap this one up. The kit was originally tooled in 2014 and then re-released in 2019, which is the particular version I have here. It's worth noting that both versions of the kit had the same included paint and decal schemes. The only difference with the 2014 release was that it matched up with the 70th anniversary of D-Day and had a small image on the box to indicate this. The kit has a skill level of 2, which I'd be inclined to agree with. It is a little more complicated to build, but it's not a massive skill jump from the easier kits in the Airfix range. The only area it might present any real challenge is with the slightly more complicated Royal Navy paint scheme. Retailing for a price of £9.99 in the UK at the time this video was made, I think that price is just slightly too high. I appreciate that it's a Series 2 kit and comes with 2 paint schemes, which brings it in line with the price of other Series 2 models, but it still doesn't have the highest part count, and I wouldn't really have had an issue if it only came with 1 decal option. With that being said, if you could find it slightly cheaper, then it would be worth it, but I certainly would not pay more. Generally though, this is a good kit of an interesting subject, and I'm more than happy with how mine has turned out. If you enjoyed this video or found it useful, please consider pressing that like button, and also feel free to leave a comment with a suggestion for more model builds you might like to see. Make sure you subscribe with notifications on so that you never miss a modelling video too. As always, honourable mention and massive thanks to my patrons over on Patreon. To find out how you can help support the channel and join these people here, take a look at the links in the description. Speaking of the description box, you'll also find links to my social media accounts. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook and Discord. Finally, a massive thank you to you for watching this video, and I'll see you all on the workbench again next time.